Emily Reynolds sat in the dim nursery, her arms wrapped tightly around her son, Oliver. The soft glow of the nightlight cast long shadows across the walls, turning the room into a surreal dreamscape. She rocked him gently, murmuring lullabies, though she knew they would not help. Nothing ever did. At 6 months old, Oliver had never kicked his legs, never curled his toes in response to touch. The doctors had called it congenital paralysis, a cruel twist of fate, leaving her son trapped in his own body. He could cry, blink, and grasp weakly with his fingers, but beyond that, his world was stillness. Tonight was no different. His whimpers were soft but persistent, a sound that gnawed at Emily's already frayed nerves. She had tried everything, adjusting the room temperature, rocking him, singing, but exhaustion was winning. Her eyes burned, her body ached, and the weight of helplessness pressed against her chest like a vice. On the nursery floor, Max, their golden retriever puppy, sat alert, his golden coat gleaming in the faint light. He was only 4 months old, just a baby himself, but he never left Oliver's side. Lately, his behavior had changed. He was more watchful, more insistent. He would whimper at odd times, staring at Oliver with unsettling intensity. Emily sighed and laid Oliver gently in his crib. His small chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. She ran a tired hand through her disheveled hair and collapsed into the rocking chair, her body surrendering to exhaustion. She barely noticed when her eyelids fluttered closed. Hashtag, 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 a whisper in the dark. A sharp rustling sound snapped her awake. Emily bolted upright, her pulse hammering in her ears. The room was eerily still, save for the rhythmic tick of the wall clock. She turned toward the crib. Oliver was fast asleep. But Max was not. The puppy stood rigid beside the crib, his ears perked, his gaze locked onto Oliver. His body trembled with anticipation, as though he were waiting for something unseen. Then, in one swift motion, he placed a paw gently over Oliver's tiny legs. A chill ran down Emily's spine. "What are you doing, Max?" she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. The puppy didn't react. His focus remained fixed, his breathing shallow and controlled. The nursery monitor flickered on the nightstand, its screen blank for a split second before returning to normal. Emily swallowed hard. Something about this moment felt wrong. Carefully, she leaned forward and reached for Max, lifting him away from the crib. He let out a soft whine, but didn't resist. She placed him on the floor, stroking his fur to calm him. "You're just a puppy," she murmured, trying to convince herself more than him. "It's okay. Everything's okay." But deep inside, she wasn't sure. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag a pat of unease. The following nights were worse. Max refused to leave Oliver's crib. He barely touched his food and barked at seemingly nothing. Every night, he pressed his paw against Oliver's legs, his gaze fixed with unwavering determination. Emily started watching more closely. At first, it seemed impossible. Oliver was moving. Not much, just tiny, barely perceptible twitches. A finger shifting, a muscle flickering. It could have been a trick of the light, a desperate illusion created by an exhausted mother's mind. But the baby monitor recordings told a different story. She watched them over and over again. Each time, Max's paw rested on Oliver's legs, and each time the tiny movements followed. Emily's breath hitched as she replayed the footage in slow motion. Could it be coincidence? Or was Max somehow, asterisk, asterisk, no, that was ridiculous, asterisk, asterisk. And yet, a thought, reckless and absurd, clawed at the edges of her mind. Could Max be sensing something the doctors couldn't? She needed proof. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag the first test. The next evening, Emily set up her phone to record. Max, as expected, took his place beside the crib. His body was coiled tight, his eyes flicking between Oliver and something unseen. Emily's stomach twisted in anticipation. Then it happened. Max lifted his paw and placed it gently over Oliver's legs. Almost instantly, Oliver's tiny fingers curled inward ever so slightly. Emily gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. It wasn't her imagination. For a moment, she felt lightheaded, as though reality had slipped just out of reach. She leaned closer, staring at her baby, willing it to happen again. And then it did. Another small twitch. A movement where there should have been none. Emily's vision blurred with tears. Could this be real? Was Oliver feeling something? The rational part of her brain screamed for logic. Babies with congenital paralysis don't just start moving. But logic had no place here. Not when she had seen it with her own eyes. She needed Daniel to see this. Hashtag skepticism in shadows. Daniel sat stiffly on the couch, his brows drawn together as he watched the recording. This could just be a muscle spasm, he said after a long silence. Emily clenched her fists. She knew he would react like this. Daniel was a scientist. He needed data, explanations. Asterisk, but this wasn't about science. This was about their son. I've been watching him for 6 months, she shot back. He's never moved like this before. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his temple. Emily, I know you want to believe this, but we can't get our hopes up. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. She wanted to scream, to shake him and make him see what she saw. But she didn't. Instead, she stood abruptly. I'm going to keep recording. Daniel sighed but didn't argue. He knew better than to try. That night, Emily stayed awake, watching, waiting. The nursery was silent, save for the soft rise and fall of Oliver's breaths. And then Max moved. He lifted his paw again, pressing it gently against Oliver's leg. And this time, Oliver's entire foot twitched. A strangled sob escaped Emily's throat. This was real. This was happening. But just as she reached for her phone to capture the moment, Max did something even stranger. He whimpered, not his usual soft whines, but something raw and urgent. He turned sharply toward the window, ears flattened. Emily's breath caught. She followed his gaze. Outside, through the sheer curtains, the night loomed dark and vast. A strange flicker of movement in the shadows sent ice down her spine. Something was wrong, and Max knew it. Hashtag the unknown lurks. Emily's heart pounded. The puppy let out a low, warning growl. His body was tense, poised for something Emily couldn't see. She took a shaky step toward the window, her pulse roaring in her ears. Then, the power went out. The nightlight, the baby monitor, even the hallway light. Gone. Darkness swallowed the room, thick and suffocating. Max barked. Once. Twice. 3 times. And then, Oliver stirred. A tiny, unmistakable movement. Emily froze. Max wasn't just watching Oliver. He was protecting him. From what? Emily didn't know. But she was about to find out. Emily's breath came in quick, shallow gasps as she pressed herself against the nursery wall, straining to hear beyond the frantic pounding of her own heart. The sudden blackout had plunged the house into a suffocating darkness, and the only sound was Max's low, guttural growl. The puppy stood rigid by Oliver's crib, his fur bristling, his body coiled like a spring. Emily reached blindly for her phone on the nightstand, her fingers fumbling in the dark. The screen flared to life, casting an eerie glow across the room. She turned on the flashlight, sweeping the beam toward the window. The curtains fluttered slightly, but the glass was intact. Outside, the world was silent. Max gave another sharp bark, his gaze still locked on the window. Emily hesitated, torn between fear and logic. She forced herself to take slow, deliberate steps toward it, her pulse hammering in her ears. She yanked the curtains apart, her breath hitching as she peered into the night. The backyard stretched into an ink-black void, the faint outline of the wooden fence barely visible under the dim moonlight. Nothing moved. No figures, no shadows. Just the steady rustling of leaves in the wind. A noise behind her made her spin. Daniel. He stood in the doorway, his phone's flashlight casting strange, sharp angles across his face. His brow was furrowed, sleep still heavy in his eyes. What's going on? His voice was thick with concern. The power's out, Emily whispered. Max is acting strange. He's been staring at the window, growling. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his exhaustion evident. It's probably just the storm. A transformer must have blown. Emily hesitated, glancing down at Max. The puppy had stopped growling, but remained on high alert, his tail stiff, ears twitching at every tiny sound. Maybe, she murmured, but I don't think it's just that. Daniel exhaled heavily. Emily, I know how this sounds, she interrupted, voice edged with frustration. But something is happening, Daniel. First, the baby monitor flickers. Then Oliver moves for the first time in his life. Now Max is acting like there's something here. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. It's late. We're exhausted. Let's get some sleep. We'll check the circuit breaker in the morning. Emily clenched her jaw, knowing there was no point in arguing. She turned back toward Oliver's crib. The baby slept peacefully, unaware of the storm raging inside his mother's mind. Still, when she lay down that night, she didn't sleep, and neither did Max. Morning brought no clarity. The power had returned at some point before dawn, but Emily's thoughts remained tangled. She found herself staring at Oliver more than usual, searching for any sign that what she had witnessed was real and not some cruel trick of exhaustion. Daniel had already left for work, and the house was eerily quiet. Max, never one to sit still, lay by the crib, his amber eyes flicking toward Oliver every few moments, as if waiting for something to happen. Emily hesitated before pulling out her phone. She scrolled through the baby monitor footage, her fingers trembling slightly as she skipped to the previous night's recording. And then she saw it, a shadow. It wasn't outside the window. It was inside the room. The footage was grainy in the low light, but there was no mistaking it. A dark shape flickered in the farthest corner of the nursery, near the closet. It wasn't there at the beginning of the recording, but as the minutes passed, it slowly became more distinct. It didn't move, didn't shift, just appeared. Then came the moment that sent ice through her veins. Max reacted to it. The puppy's head snapped toward the corner, his ears flat against his skull. His growl started low, building into a frantic bark, right before the power cut out. The screen went black. Emily's breath hitched. Had someone been in the house? No, that was impossible. The doors were locked, the alarm system armed. But then what? A knock at the front door made her jump. She hurried to answer, her nerves fraying as she peered through the peephole. Mrs. Thompson, her elderly neighbor, stood on the porch, clutching a small basket of muffins. Her eyes, always kind, were filled with something else today. Concern. Emily forced a smile and opened the door. "Morning, dear," Mrs. Thompson said, her gaze flicking past Emily and into the house. "I just wanted to check in. The power outage last night was strange, wasn't it?" Emily nodded. "Yeah, it was." The old woman hesitated. "I saw your lights flicker off before the rest of the block. I thought that was odd." Emily's stomach twisted. She hadn't noticed that. "Are you sure?" Mrs. Thompson nodded slowly. "I was up late with my radio. Everything else was working fine, until your house went dark. Then the whole street followed a few minutes later." A chill ran through Emily's spine. Max appeared at her feet, nudging her ankle, his tail wagging but his expression serious. The older woman's eyes softened as she looked down at him. "That dog of yours, he's special." Emily gave a tired chuckle. "Yeah, he's been acting strange lately." Mrs. Thompson's expression turned pensive. "I had a dog like him once. A collie named Jasper. Smartest dog I ever had. He could sense things before they happened." Emily frowned. "Like what?" The woman's gaze drifted past her, as if she were looking at something unseen. Danger, illness, even death. A shiver traced Emily's spine. She swallowed. "Max! He's been acting protective of Oliver. And last night, I think he sensed something." Mrs. Thompson nodded slowly. "Some animals have a gift, dear. They can see what we don't." Emily's grip on the door tightened. "You think Max is warning us?" The old woman placed a gentle hand on Emily's arm. "I think you should listen to him." Emily forced a smile, but her heart pounded against her ribs. After Mrs. Thompson left, she returned to the nursery, sitting beside Max on the floor. She ran her fingers through his soft fur, trying to calm the unease curling in her stomach. "Show me, Max," she whispered. "If there's something here, show me." Max lifted his head, his eyes locked onto hers, as if he understood. That night, Emily didn't just watch. She waited. The baby monitor was on. Her phone was recording. Max was in position. And at exactly 2:13 a.m., Oliver moved again. Not just a twitch. His entire leg shifted. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Then Max's ears flattened. He turned sharply toward the closet, his body tense. A sound, faint, almost imperceptible. A whisper. Emily's blood turned to ice. She grabbed the baby monitor and hit rewind. Static filled the screen, the footage blurring for a moment before sharpening. She played it again. The whisper was real, and it said one word: run. Emily's hands trembled as she clutched the baby monitor, replaying the recording over and over. The whisper was faint, distorted by static, but unmistakable. Run. The word sent ice through her veins. It wasn't Daniel's voice. It wasn't hers. It wasn't possible. Max whimpered beside her, his body pressed close, his warmth the only thing grounding her in reality. Oliver stirred in his crib, oblivious to the growing dread that coiled in his mother's chest. Emily's thoughts raced. Could it have been a glitch? A stray frequency from a neighbor's radio? But no, every fiber of her being rejected those explanations. It had felt deliberate, targeted. The whisper had come at the exact moment Oliver moved. She turned to Max, his golden fur barely visible in the dim light. He had known. He had sensed something from the beginning. Emily closed her eyes and forced a breath into her lungs. Panic would solve nothing. She needed proof, something undeniable that even Daniel couldn't dismiss. She reached for her phone and started a new recording. "Tell me what you want," she whispered into the darkness. Silence. Max's ears twitched. He lifted his head toward the closet. Emily swallowed hard. "Are you warning me?" Still nothing. Minutes passed. She let the recording run, her pulse steadying only slightly. Maybe it was just a freak occurrence. Maybe a soft thud. She froze. The sound had come from inside the closet. Her body stiffened as she reached for the lamp, flicking it on with shaky fingers. The warm glow illuminated the room, pushing back the shadows, revealing the nursery exactly as it had been. Nothing out of place. No lurking figures. The closet door was closed. Max, however, was no longer looking at it. He was looking at Oliver. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Oliver's foot moved again. Not a twitch, not a spasm. A movement. Slow, deliberate. Her vision blurred as she choked on a sob. This wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. It was real. She grabbed her phone, scrambling to check the recording. The audio was clear, no static this time. Just her voice, the silence that followed, and then another whisper. "Help him." Emily's heart slammed against her ribs. She bolted to her feet, yanking open the closet door. It was empty, just a row of tiny clothes, shelves stocked with diapers, a few storage boxes. No hidden intruders. No explanation. She turned back to the crib. Oliver's tiny fingers curled slightly. His foot twitched again. Max let out a quiet whine, shifting closer to the baby. Emily pressed a hand to her mouth, tears slipping down her cheeks. She didn't understand what was happening. She didn't know why Max seemed connected to it. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Oliver was changing. And whatever had whispered to her in the dark wanted her to help him. Daniel sat in stunned silence, watching the video Emily had recorded the night before. He didn't speak, didn't blink. Emily had expected skepticism, resistance. Instead, he looked shaken. "I checked the monitor logs," he finally said, voice tight. There was no interference. No outside signals. Emily folded her arms, waiting. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "This doesn't make sense." "It doesn't have to," she shot back. "It's happening." Daniel hesitated before turning to Oliver, who lay cooing softly in his crib, his little fingers flexed, his eyelids fluttering. And then, right before their eyes, his foot moved again. Daniel sucked in a breath. Emily reached down, her fingers brushing Oliver's legs. "What if Max is doing this?" she whispered. Daniel frowned. "That's not possible." "Then explain it." Silence. Max lifted his head at the sound of their voices, ears perking up. He glanced at Oliver, then at Emily, as if waiting for something. Daniel exhaled, his scientific mind warring with what he was seeing. "There's a way to test it." Emily stiffened. "Tess, we isolate variables," he said, slipping into clinical mode. "If Max is somehow stimulating Oliver's nerves, we should be able to measure it." Emily hesitated, unsure how she felt about reducing this to an experiment. But if it gave them answers, if it made Daniel believe, she had to try. The test was simple. They placed Oliver on a soft blanket in the living room, away from his crib, away from any environmental factors that could be influencing him. Daniel monitored his movements while Emily sat on the couch, Max beside her. For 15 minutes, nothing happened. Then Max moved. He stepped forward hesitantly, ears flicking. Slowly, he pressed his paw against Oliver's leg, and Oliver reacted, a sharp, unmistakable twitch, a jolt of motion that had never been there before. Emily let out a strangled sound, her hands flying to her mouth. Daniel's face paled. "Oh my God!" Max didn't move his paw. He remained perfectly still, watching Oliver with an intensity that sent a shiver down Emily's spine. Another movement. This time, Oliver's knee bent, just slightly but undeniably. Daniel scrambled for his phone, opening a medical app. His hands shook as he tested Oliver's reflexes. There was still weakness, but something was changing. "This isn't random," he murmured. "This isn't a fluke." Emily wiped at her tears. "What does it mean?" Daniel didn't answer. He was already typing furiously on his phone, searching medical databases, research papers. Max finally stepped back, his job done, and Oliver smiled. Doctors were skeptical at first. They ran test after test, expecting to find a rational explanation, nerve regeneration, misdiagnosis, something that made sense. But they found nothing. No medical precedent. No clear cause. Only Max, the golden retriever who, inexplicably, was triggering something in Oliver's nervous system. The story spread, first to doctors, then to journalists, then to the world. Experts flocked to study Oliver and Max, desperate to understand what was happening. Some theorized it was a form of neurostimulation, an effect never documented before. Others whispered about miracles. Emily didn't care what they called it. All she knew was that her son had moved, and he kept moving. Days turned into weeks, and the changes were undeniable. Oliver's small twitches became controlled movements. His once lifeless legs showed strength. His fingers gripped toys with newfound determination. Then one afternoon, with cameras rolling and doctors watching, Oliver did the impossible. He lifted his arms. He reached for Max. Emily broke down, sobbing into her hands as the room erupted in gasps. Max wagged his tail, tongue lolling in a happy pant, as if he had known this would happen all along. A scientist later called it canine-induced neurostimulation. Others debated the legitimacy of the findings. But Emily knew the truth. This was a miracle, and it had come in the form of a puppy. Months later, Emily sat on the floor of their home. Max curled beside her. Oliver, now stronger than anyone had dared hope, lay beside him, his small fingers buried in golden fur. And then, with careful determination, he moved. He pushed himself up. He steadied himself. And, for the first time in his life, Oliver took a step, straight into Max's waiting paws.